I'm very happy to announce the talk today in the SPAGAD series, the Speech Acts in Grammar and Discourse series. We have today Hans-Martin Gärtner, a talk by Hans-Martin Gärtner and by Andreas Pankau. Hans-Martin, I know him for a very long time. Actually, we met in Tucson in 1999, where I am right now at the Virtual Conference. And I'm very happy that he joins us as a vice director from 2001 to, I think, 2012, before he went on to the Hungarian Academy of Science and now the Institute of Linguistics in Budapest. He had major contributions on syntax and the syntax-semantic interface, in particular on root phenomena, which relates, of course, to our work on speech acts and our interest in speech acts here, but also in many other fields with a focus on syntax in Germanic languages and many other languages like Tagalog, for example, or Hungarian. His work is characterized in a great attention to detail, in confrontation of sometimes arcane predictions of theories with sometimes arcane phenomena, and this brings forward the field. He also does a great service to the field as a co-editor, or the editor who does most of things in Theoretical Linguistics, an open peer-reviewed journal, which we started in, I think, in 2001 as well. And without his work, his attention to all the processes involved in that, this journal would never have the standing as it has now. He proposed Andreas Pankau as a co-speaker from Freie Universität Berlin. Andreas has also worked on syntax and syntax semantics interface with a focus on Germanic languages, for example, on working subjects in North Germanic languages and on RWH constructions in German. This was the topic of his 2013 dissertation at the University of Utrecht. And today they will talk about their fieldwork in Berlin, or rather from the extreme east of Berlin, Marzahn, which has a certain notoriety for its architecture, and we will hear something about the language there, namely on the expression of a particular subtype of questions, exam questions. And this will be commented by Grzegorz Gaszczyk from the University of Groningen. He's doing highly interesting work on norms of speech acts with a focus on assertions, but also on other speech acts. For example, selfless assertions or lies. These are assertions of what one knows to be false, but it is for the benefit of the addressee. This is essential for the social domain of speech acts, which I still consider quite under-researched and of a great potential for linguistics. And without further ado, please start.
Okay, so thanks for the invitation and the introduction. That was very generous. And so I will present, but Andreas is in the audience and he will be there for he's the native speaker, so he'll be there for the empirical questions and also for some additional background, because this is kind of an outtake of a larger project that he himself started earlier. And there's much more to say, which we cannot cover here. We're just concentrating mainly on the exam question. Okay. So here is a longer abstract. We had only these 2 sentences. Now we have a longer abstract for a different purpose. So I just read this, and if you follow this, you can then doze off or do something else on your Friday. So this is the gist of what's happening. So new data from interrogative marking in Berlin Marzahn German provide striking grammatical evidence for Levinson's conjecture that askings of information questions come with a social cost. At least we think so. The same data complicate the analysis of exam questions as pretense information questions, which is appealed to by Plunz and Zimmermann in their critique of the approach to German sentence types and speech acts by Hubert Struckenbrodt. We will present a study of the grammar and pragmatics of a variety of German that requires the interrogative particle n in information-seeking questions and bans it from many special questions in the sense of Bayer, Obenauer, and Obenauer, exam questions among those where it's banned, this particle. Our analysis will build on the theory of use conditions as laid out by Daniel Gutzmann and formulate Levinsonian social cost in terms of a constraint on the particle n, expressive of the speaker's obligingness toward the addressee. So this is the use condition you can see here. It is fairly easy to see, but will be motivated in our paper in detail, that such a condition is not called for in the case of exam questions. Equally, we will dispel the objection that the data are due to simple register effects. We are also going to discuss the ramifications our approach has for notions of markedness or markedness reversal, taking the idea of reinforcement of defaults by Farkas into account. Further, we will look into the differences and interaction between n and question particle den, as well as reasons for dismissing the purely epistemic approach to the Marzahn German data by Pankau 2018. So I hope we can cover most of this, and other things could be left for the question period. So let's start setting off the problem with, there's this approach by Hubert Tuckenbrot to the sentence type meaning of interrogatives, as he called it. So what the grammar brings, as the conventionalized meaning. And this has been called the intersubjective analysis by Blunze and Zimmermann, because it contains inside this appeal to the common ground. It says that it's like a use of an interrogative is a volitional, expresses a volitional attitude by the speaker, such that the addressee sees to it that a common ground arises with respect to the issue expressed by the prejacent by P. So this is appeal to common ground, and this can then plays out depending on the context. So if salient speaker, if speaker ignorance is salient, then we're dealing with an information-seeking question often. If speaker competence is salient, we have different situations. For example, we can get rhetorical questions like who likes to pay taxes, and the common ground would then be reached by the addressee making an assumption like no one likes to pay taxes. So this pseudo-assertive use of interrogatives. And also if speaker competence is salient, this could be an exam question situation like teacher asking who stabbed Caesar. And here common ground would be reached by A making A's competence manifest, so being able to answer the question. So this would be the two several cases where the common ground plays a different kind of role. Just as a background, so the Hubert's theory builds heavily on Dietmar Zeffra's approach to the structural meaning of sentence types. And this ran into some problems in the area of the analysis of assertions, which was pointed out by Searle and elaborated on by a paper of myself on the evidential use or the quotational use of Wollen. And just to fill you in on this, the see to it operator is used in the logic of agency, and I like it better than other things that you could plug in the same position. So this is there's a whole industry of like a modal logics of action that use this operator. And here just so this the recursive component of the common ground, which Hubert appeals to explicitly in his paper. This is of course Stalnacker's idea that mutual knowledge, so common ground is not just knowledge like mutual knowledge of the fact, but also this meta knowledge that you believe the other to believe P and so on, and this recursive beliefs. So this is actually part of Hubert's appeal and saying, well, for exam questions, this is exactly what you want, and therefore this is a nice general approach to uses of interrogatives. Okay, then the alternative, the kind of classical alternative is what Blunze and Zimmermann call the subjective epistemic analysis, things like NYTK formulated earlier on, so that the speaker wants that the addressee sees to it that the speaker gets to know the answer to P, basically. So this is no longer appeal to common ground is made. So there's this subjective component. It's only about the speaker knowledge, in a sense. Yeah, speaker filling in speaker ignorance. And what they say about exam questions is, so Plunzer and Zimmermann is in that case, so you don't have a particular approach to exam questions, you just say there's a pretense of speaker ignorance. And I come back to that later. So, and an argument in favor of this approach is actually given by examples like 5. So in exam situations, you can actually say something like, I would like to know from you who stabbed Caesar. You can kind of make this explicit. Sorry for the typo. So I would like to know, you can use this and kind of make explicit this subjective epistemic analysis. So you could say there's a non-literal use of 5, which is unavoidable in exam situations. Therefore, it's not implausible to also appeal to the same thing with respect to the matrix. So who stabbed Caesar? That is actually the same kind of non-literal use as Plunzer and Zimmermann say. And then if you use the analysis in 4 as the default, you can actually use that to resolve underdetermined cases. And I'm showing you this, the core example immediately. Just to fill you in on this Plunzer-Zimmermann argument against the Trockenbrot approach. So according to NYTK, interrogatives are ambiguous between genuine information-seeking ones and exam questions. And we agree with Trockenbrot that this is certainly not an attractive option, apart from methodological considerations like Occam's razor pertaining to underlying expressions. Independent evidence for an ambiguity in interrogative seems hard to come by. If anything, the usual tests point in the opposite direction. And here's an important example. For instance, if John, who is completely ignorant in these matters, asks his daughter Mary whether the square root of 2 is rational, it seems to us that she may truthfully respond, my math teacher already asked me this question in the morning, thereby type identifying the teacher's exam question act with her father's genuine request for information. So there must be a close connection between exam questions and information questions to allow this type identification. And we come back to that later. So just to fill you also in, so Searle already kind of recognized that there are 2 kinds of questions. So in his famous taxonomies, he already said there's information questions and exam questions, but he doesn't really go into the level at which the analysis is done. So Hubert's is maybe the most radical in trying to deal with it at the level of conventionalized sentence type meaning. Others, if you're going more pragmatic, you're not running into the same kinds of problems. So here's this the characterization of what pretense means. So when A's teacher inquired about the murder of Caesar, it was clear to all participants that she was not seeking historical enlightenment. Hence, a literal use of the interrogative was out of the question, by which the way was paved for a non-literal construal. What might this construal have been and how did it come about? In a nutshell, by pretense. The speaker's linguistic behavior was that of an ignoramus who would have put the question to elicit an answer. By playing the ignoramus's part, the teacher, though in the know, indicates her desire to elicit the same reaction by the student. So the same reaction as if it were an information question. So this is the pretense, the characterization of what they mean. And here's one of the problems that this kind of the default approach, the subjective epistemic NYTK approach is more intuitive in resolving. So a situation like A entering S's taxi and says, well, to the British Embassy, please. And the taxi driver, the speaker says then, where's the British Embassy? Okay, now what their comment is, A's request makes it highly probable that he assumes that the taxi driver knows where the British embassy is, and the taxi driver will recognize it. Nevertheless, S can assume faithfully that the passenger will understand the taxi driver's utterance as a somewhat surprising request for information. Why is that so? Arguably, the best answer is that the taxi driver will expect the passenger's knowledge of the meaning of the uttered interrogative and the assumption that S means what this sentence means. So if you can rely on this meaning default, you don't have to compute any complicated situational parameters. So Hubert, he would have to block parameters like where S knows the answer and assumes that A doesn't know the answer. This could be a jocular use of a question, like in Berlin. This could easily happen with the taxi drivers being quite sophisticated in their humor. So that asking where's the British embassy could just be an attempt to tease or shock the passenger or something, whatever. Or where this, like the taxi driver knows and assumes the addressee, so the passenger does too. This could be meant as a rhetorical question or even some kind of examination question, whatever kinds of, I don't know whether other countries allow this kind of approach to taxi driving. But anyway, this would be, Hubert would have to rule out such scenarios to say, well, these are so implausible that we have to come back to this information question reading, which you get for free if you say that's the default, the sentence type meaning of interrogatives. So this is kind of a pretty strong case actually to reconsider. However, now comes the challenge. So in Berlin, Marzahn German constitute interrogatives. Exam questions are expressed in a different way from information questions. So there's this ominous particle N, which is not identical to the German, the standard German particle den, but of course it's derived from that. But it has the following distribution. So if you leave it out, you say, wer hat Cäsar erstochen, who stabbed Caesar? This can only be an examination question, but not an information question, if we only have these two choices. So not an information question, but exam question. And conversely, wer hat Cäsar erstochen? This would be the information question, but not the exam question. And what this shows immediately is that a pretense approach would run into problems here, because if you have to pretend that you're asking an information question, why don't you use the form that expresses an information question? Yeah, you have to use the 6a form as the teacher. So here is a real challenge to the pretense theory. Okay, very briefly about, so Andreas could say much more about this, but very briefly, so Marzahn is in the northeast of Berlin, where the arrow points you. You have to know a little bit about Berlin. And it's a bit like New York, but without the banks and without the gangsters. There's some literature on it, like this East Berlin urban variety research by Norbert Dittmar. Particularly, there's like a so-called Wende corpus, so a corpus of interviews after reunification. And there's actually a recent dissertation on actually even question acts for based on this Wende corpus. So there's much more to say about the varieties. But then it's definitely an East Berlin variety, which is not identical. And it's best actually kept isolated from other varieties, because Prenzlberg and other areas, they are different, it seems. So very few, like just a short profile. So this particle N criticizes to C0 material, so linke Satzklammer in German. So the finite verb or complementizer, or WH suspect CP material if that C is covert. It's not licensed in polar interrogatives, this particular particle N. And also, maybe most interesting for this audience, it's root sensitive. It's probably a strong root sensitive particle. So it has this the classical distinction between I ask myself, wohn dit gewesen sein soll, where it should have been, so a live question. And it's not good in the I know where that might have been. So the difference between intentional and extensional, or like speech acty and non-speech acty kinds of dependent interrogatives. And also interesting to point out, there is a similar phenomenon of grammaticalized and in Thuringian and Bavarian with different properties, but not yet researched as deeply as this Marzahn German. So there's more to do, and hopefully even more varieties that can be studied later on or found, detected. Okay, so here's hey, wait a minute. Yeah, so aren't you just doing something, a mistake here? Isn't this just a standard German register used in schools? Yeah, so that this explains the absence of this particle n. And this is not what's going on. So one can counter this argument in several ways. For example, the endless variety of interrogatives is widely used outside of, so for non-information questions in ordinary conversation. So it has nothing to do with specific registers. So in guess questions, expository or rhetorical questions in ordinary conversation, still you have these, the obligatory drop of particle n. And also, if you're in the classroom, you can actually, so teachers are like, or do make a difference between questions that are kind of, personal and have nothing to do with examination, like somebody arriving late to school, they can ask, or they will ask, why are you late? Wieso bist du zu spät with N? And then move on, talking to the same student and ask, now let's come to our lesson. So warum hat Brutus Caesar gesprochen without N? So you're in the same classroom, same setting, same pair of participants. You switch from N information question to non-N in the exam or examination kind of context. Also, so this is one example of the previously mentioned. So riddle or guess questions in entirely informal language, but still you don't use the N. So what hat vier Beine und kann fliegen? So what has four legs and can fly? So you can tease your interlocutor with this, and you have to leave out the N particle here. So with this kind of riddle, like Wilson and Sperber describe these, for example. Okay. So, and here is another point, so about markedness and the question of how to relate this to the debate on canonical and non-canonical questions, something that Donka Farkas has worked on, very influential work in recent years. And this is an early version of what now appeared in the journal Semantics. So this is from a draft, and this has been revised later, but it's still we took this as a starting point. So a discourse participant asks a canonical question if she utters a D, so with an unmarked interrogative in a context in which the recognized aim of the conversation is to increase information relative to the issue expressed by the interrogative. So D means discourse marker, so without marker. You have this canonical information questions. So D unmarked, lacking discourse marker. And such markers, they would contribute presuppositions and override default settings or trigger additional discourse effects. So this is the function of D markers to make a question non-canonical. And this, of course, makes a lot of sense. So if you look at wohl in German, that makes things a conjecture or a reflective question. If you insert schon, you get these rhetorical questions. If you insert noch, you get the remind me questions. So then the question is, of course, what about this Marzahn German? And so you probably don't want to say that making something an information question is non-canonical, at least not from that perspective. Okay, so here are two theories that we are pursuing or have been pursuing. And so one theory or one like early approach to N was to postulate a use condition just reflecting speaker ignorance. So speaker doesn't know the answer to P. That was proposed in Andreas Pankau's original theory. So this correlates quite closely to information questions. And the new theory that we think has advantage is the theory O. So to say, well, using N actually expresses some kind of obligingness, the payment of a minimal social fee. And this would actually then make information questions marked, and this chimes in very well with the ideas by Stephen Levinson, who has described this in 2012, that informational gain runs parallel to social debt. So he has a longer description of an economics of uses of speech acts, and from the perspective of interpersonal relations and parameters of politeness, you can say that putting people on the spot with information questions is actually iffy, and can have this kind of conventionalized debt on the questioner, which means N can be looked at as actually paying this debt with a symbolic acknowledgement, basically, or obligingness with respect to the addressee. Okay, and of course, in examination questions, there's no such payment. So you could say, well, first of all, there's no real information gain here. It's just so the questioner is already in the know. And of course, also in school, of course, there's this institutional contract. Basically, you're supposed to answer questions. You're not, teachers don't have to pay you for that. So there's good reasons to say N is inadequate. So this obligingness is not adequate in this context. Okay, now, so this is the idea, to go for theory O and also to dismiss theory K. And what we have to check is in examination questions where speaker competence is reduced in some sense. So this is an interesting environment where you can tease the theories apart. And of course, in further steps, you want a full usage profile of the Marzahn German endless interrogatives. So we give just a couple of examples, I think, and they all seem to go in the direction of what we think is correct. So, for example, if you, as a teacher, check on tasks that don't have a prefab answer or solution, it's much less natural to say that the speaker knows or the teacher knows the answer. So, for example, if you read a novel jointly in class, the examination can actually be something like, how do you interpret the final chapter? Wie interpretierst du das Schlusskapitel? And there the N again would be inappropriate, even if the teacher has no clue how the examinee does interpret the final chapter. Yeah. So it would be contrived to say that the teacher has available all the answers to that question. So you can kind of try this out if you want, but we think there's good reason to say there's to some extent speaker ignorance here. Same like you send examinees out on a wildlife observation task, and this can actually be over the summer. So wherever you are, do some observations, and then they come back after the summer and you ask, so was hast du für Tiere? What kinds of animals did you see? Again, the N has to be missing. And again, there's good reason to think, so you don't know where they went. They might have gone on Mars or something with Elon Musk. And so what kinds of animals they saw there, you have no clue. So that again would favor so you're not obliged, so you are not using N for that reason, although you are ignorant. So theory K would make the wrong prediction. Another example, echo questions. So if somebody says, ich war gestern in something you can't hear, then B can ask, wo warst du gestern? And again, you wouldn't use the N here. Yeah, and what you could say about from the perspective of theory O is A has offered information like freely, so you're not paying for that. Yeah, so there's no reason to ask to pay for something that A has actually offered. On the other hand, of course, B is ignorant of the value of wo, hasn't understood. So in that respect, again, there would be speaker ignorance. And again, theory O is favored over theory K in this domain. Proxy questions, a slightly longer story, but basically somebody who has an ailment and can't go to the doctor calls over the phone, and the person who goes to the phone relays the doctor's question. So goes back to the ill person and then asks, wie groß ist die Schwellung? How big is the swelling? Not using the N. So the proxy questioner doesn't use the N because the proxy questioner isn't interested and doesn't have to pay a social fee to the ill person. Although, again, neither that proxy questioner nor the doctor necessarily know the answer. So you can see that maybe the swelling is under a plaster or something covered, so the ill person has to check themselves. So again, obligingness is not called for. Ignorance is in principle there. So you can again say that I always favored over K. You can vary this situation. You can say, well, maybe, so if the doctor is overhearing over a loudspeaker, then the proxy questioner might actually use N because it's a kind of speaking for the doctor, and the doctor is the one who is interested in the information. So you could say, well, if there's this transparent overhearing situation, and maybe the doctor isn't a native speaker of Marzahn German, then so you have this kind of possibility to use N here for the doctor, basically. And then also like repeated questions. So you ask, wo jetzt denn jetzt zum Bahnhof, where can I get to the station, with the N, because it's an information question. If the addressee doesn't react, if you repeat it, wo hier zum Bahnhof geht, is without the N. That's the typical way of repeating. And again, since you already paid the social fee in the first utterance, you're not paying again. Although you're still ignorant of the value of wo. But so yeah, so kind of you can also account for this. Let's say it's compatible with the O approach to say, well, these repeat questions don't use the N. Okay, so so we got the very good question in Cologne recently on Monday that so how transparent is this? Do the addressees really understand what obliging means? And the answer is kind of no, it's not like saying bitte. So bitte is more transparently like you are asking a favor. It's more abstract, and it's more like the famous descriptive ineffability that that particles often have. So that Chris Potts makes so uses or appeals to quite extensively. So there's this expressive payment by the speaker to the addressee, but it's an abstract. So it's performed by the use of the N, but it's abstract enough to say, well, it's not something yet that you can put into words. And so this is also what has been said by Kaplan about ouch, or Daniel Gutzmann also uses this example that it's not entirely clear. So you don't give really lexical content or semantic information to the word ouch. You just say it relates to context at which the agent is in pain. Yeah, but it's not descriptive in that sense. So we would like to go in that direction and say, so it's obliging in scare quotes, yeah. So that you are okay. Then also importantly, n is not den. Yeah, even so, we have already given you some reasons to believe that, but just to make sure, it's actually the two can co-occur. So Marzahn German also has this the standard German particle den, and they can actually co-occur in things like was ist denn denn mit dir los? In this kind of like surprise disapproval kind of question. So they can co-occur, and that means they are not the same thing. And it has the same kind of distribution. The real den has the distribution that it has in standard German. And another argument, so den, the standard, so the full particle can appear in conditionals, but the proper particle cannot. So in this, so somebody wants to do something, and eventually you grant, okay, wenn er denn will, if he wants, if he really wants, you can use the standard German den in conditionals, but you cannot use this particle. So the obligingness particle is out in these conditions. So you can see a reduction to den would be very difficult. So further issues, so like I think we're coming to the end already. So this is one would of course want to derive the use condition of n from the use condition of den, or at least this would be good if it could be done. So we think it can be done. So the development of standard German den to the Marzahn German mitigator n, we speculate that a path from this relevance or stringency or Redeanlass feature of this standard den to the obligingness can be derived. Because you could say, well, the use of den, so you pay attention to the addressee's affordances, you pay attention to the addressee's, or you pay attention to the common ground, to the contextual situation. So you have already this kind of helpful attitude toward the addressee, and this could then be, by another step, abstracted and reinterpreted as a generic kind of paying attention to the addressee, and so on. Yeah, so this kind of that has to be worked out, but I think this can be done. Then about markedness, so Donker-Farkas actually revised the theory in the published Journal of Semantics version, and here's what the ultimate formulation is going to is. Yeah, the proposed account predicts the existence of marked interrogative forms whose effect is to weaken or overrule default assumptions. It does not predict that this is the only type of marking possible. Nothing rules out the existence of a particle that reinforces some default assumption, rendering the interrogative thus marked not usable in contexts where the assumption is not met. So this kind of like a Jespersen cycle where the negation does the default negation. So there's a new version. So this kind of reinforcing a default assumption. However, it seems that at least the default assumptions that Donker spells out for question acts, like speaker ignorance, addressee competence, addressee compliance, and issue resolution goal, they will all run into difficulties with the examples that we've given. So speaker ignorance, this would exactly pretty much be theory K, and we've seen reasons to believe that theory K is not okay. Addressee competence, again, is iffy in these examination questions, especially each of the examinations, you don't really know what the addressee knows. Echo questions, you don't want to reinforce that. So you have to think about these other examples. So that the addressee will comply, again, you cannot just assume that. And is issue resolution goal, same thing. So all these default assumptions to reinforce these by n So that would just not be sufficient, yeah, because that would still predict, it could be used in these, for example, in rhetorical questions where you make an addressee competence assumption, for example, yeah. So this, it would just not be sufficient. So it over-generates. Okay, another issue, the acquisition issue. So Becky and I talked a little bit about this, but and this has to be actually also thought about. So how do children acquire the Marzahn German system? For example, one way of going would be like early rhetorical or proto-rhetorical questions serving as reproaches like, was hat die Mama gesagt? So what did mom tell you? Where again, the N would not be adequate. And I think this would be a way of, this kind of, so the examination, interrogation kind of context. You also, children already get a feeling for this awkward, unangenehm kind of feature of the situations. So what about the type identification? It seems that the same type identification is possible in Marzahn German. So if like a younger brother says, wer hat den Cäsar gesprochen? All of a sudden being interested in this issue, like informally, the sister can say, well, my teacher asked me that yesterday. Yeah. And of course, the teacher in Marzahn German would have used a, so without the particle n. But that can be resolved to the shared at issueness component of the IQ and EQ and doesn't have to include the use conditional component. Therefore, type identification would not be a real problem here. What about pretense? We haven't thought about this much more, but of course, pretense must play at some level. There's a variety of pretense that must play a role, but we have to think about this more. And finally, there's a philosophical issue which now leads over to Grzegorz commentary. So he has this nice manuscript on interrogatives, inquiries, and exam questions that he sent me earlier, and where he attempts an explanation of exam questions in normative terms, in the sense of norms of assertion. He argues that there will be norms of examination questions. And one component of this is that one must perform an exam question only if one has access to the answer to P and one does not officially know whether the hearer knows the answer to P. So maybe from our perspective, this would still not be entirely clear how you would deal with these open exam questions like the interpretation of the novel or the animal observation task. So this would still have to be thought about, but so Gregor will probably say more about some of this now, and so I'm happy to hear his comments, and thanks for listening. And thanks, of course, to Andreas for doing all the hard work, the donkey work. And okay, this is it.
Thanks for the comment here. This was a very interesting talk, and I'm very curious what Gregor will comment upon, and I open the floor for him.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation, and mentioning at the end my work. So what I would like to do in this 10 minutes, no more, is to present the general idea I took from your presentation, and ask 2 questions that came to my mind that can rather extend the proposal to speech-act theory. So what I take the main data from the presentation is that the Marzahn variety of German MG challenged the pretense-based explanation, among other things, of exam questions. And specifically intriguing for me was this markedness reversal. So in case of information questions, they are standardly unmarked interrogatives, so lack discourse markers. but in MG they are marked, yeah, with proper enclitic. On the other hand, the exam questions that are standardly marked, yeah, typically they are made in non-default context. Yeah, in MG, apart from that, yeah, and crucially and importantly, they are unmarked on morphosyntactic level. Yeah, there is no enclitic and so on. So, because I agree with the pretense-based, that the pretense-based explanation of exam questions is not the way to go, I wanted to focus rather on two questions that came to my mind, among others, that rather extend the proposal than are polemical in nature. Yeah, because I think that the data nicely fit into the how we think about these cases and challenge some of the proposals in this debate. So the first question that I wanted to, it's here, address is how does this data from MG fit into a general account of exam questions? So as it was already said by Hans Martin, the speech theoretic approach that I favor to exam questions starts from a pluralistic view, according to which interrogatives may be used to perform a variety of speech act types, and consider the analogy that we can say that just as flat-out assertions are default uses of declarative mood, informative questions, yes, standard cases of questions are default uses of interrogative mood. However, and what's crucial for the speech act theoretic approach, the grammatical mood does not settle, does not determine what kind of speech act type has been performed. And so, just as it was said, and here adding a bit, there are many ways in which you can perform exam questions. Yeah, typically they are made obviously in the interrogative mood. So by asking when did Caesar cross the Rubicon, but also as we heard, there can be unmarked linguistically as in MG. So there is a case for distinguishing them from information questions. But there are more cases, more possibilities to ask exam questions. So one, I think, quite also obvious way is to ask a declarative with interrogative attitude. So as it was given on one of the slides, there was this case. I would like to know from you specifically when Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or more, I think, naturally for exam questions, it could be asked, I wonder, or I'm curious whether you know when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Yeah? And finally, also in the imperative mood, not necessarily by giving order, but maybe a direct request for information, the teacher could say, tell me when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. And I think crucially, all of these cases are also available for information questions. So for me, as I think about speech acts, the natural question that arises is what distinguishes one interrogative from another. Yeah, if we do not have this special enclitics as it was given in Marzahn German. Yeah? So even though here, so there can be cases of, even though there can be a morphosyntactic differentiation of various sorts of speech acts that can be performed by interrogative sentences, it doesn't determine what type of interrogative has been made. So the starting point, or definitely the starting point for this kind of considerations in case of speech act theory is that an exam question is treated more as a label for speech act type that refers to a certain linguistic practice. And what's common is that they can be used in a variety of situations when one wants to verify the audience's knowledge. So the cases, as Hans Martin said, when the speaker is competent about P, and D, ignorant, whether the hearer knows P. So this question is more like an open-end question, how the data fit into providing the more abstract and general, not necessarily norm, as Hans-Martin showed my approach at the end, but like the general approach to individuating exam questions as a certain linguistic type. And the second question concerns exam answers, something that I'm thinking about, and I'm wondering if in your approach here there is a place for them, and if so, is there something specific about them? Maybe there is some linguistic data that, yeah, parallel to exam questions. So in short, I think that questions and answers are two sides of the same coin, yeah? And it's very much straightforward for information questions, because for them we have assertions on the other side. But the question is, what kind of speech acts are answers to exam questions? Yeah. So it seems that assertions are natural candidates. However, and I think this is crucial and a bit like the puzzle, yeah? According to many accounts of assertion on the market, assertions are treated as essentially informative speech act types, yeah, that introduce crucially new information into the discourse record, into the common ground. Yeah? So proper assertion is such that it delivers new information into the common ground. And exam answers, however, are uninformative, yeah? Because the speaker knows that the hearer is already competent regarding the answer to the question. So this speech act merely informs that the speaker knows that P. So maybe it will be a bit more straightforward when we look at the table, a very simple table, yeah, it's supposed to illustrate speakers and hearers' typical epistemic position in assertions and exam questions. Yeah. So in assertions, in typical and desired case, the speaker is competent and the hearer is ignorant. However, in case of exam answers, the speaker is assumed to be competent and the hearer is competent. Yeah? The teacher does not wait to be illuminated by the speaker, by the student with the answer to the question. So in short, exam answers, just as exam questions, are made in non-default context, which override the default way of using the declarative mood and suspend default communicative norms. So at least again, in the speech act theoretic approach, they cannot be governed by the same norms or objectives or attitudes as ordinary questions and their answers. So information questions and assertions. So if you want to maintain that, I think that exam answers are distinct, there's something special about them, then I think we should do the same for exam answers. And here I'm just wondering what's your approach to this. Thanks.
About the empirical part of the exam answer issue, maybe Andreas can say something about that. But from a more abstract point of view, I would definitely say that there are certain particles, of course, that wouldn't be adequate in exam answers. Like, so Manfred pointed out these commitment markers, like ich schwör or I really believe. So that would be really funny in an exam answer. So so what would be ich schwör in English? Forget. I swear. Yeah. So that if I swear he crossed the Rubicon, yeah, at night. So yeah, that would just be funny, yeah, to say that, or you have to believe me. Yeah, if you this kind of appeal to some kind, as if there was some kind of quarrel, that would be really strange. So that, and this, which is quite standard for assertions or certain types of assertions. So that would be a way of making distinctions here. So starting to collect conditions on exam answers. As for the overall approach, it was a bit misleading, maybe the title, that we didn't really give you a narrow grammar of exam questions. We just put them in the family of question types that share this absence of the particle n. So it's much more about the particle n and its distribution, and then we still need context and all kinds of other factors to get to the real speech acts. So this is, in that sense, incomplete, and so we don't have a language here which singles out exam questions or exam answers as grammatically entirely distinct from everything else. It's part of a family of special questions, and not all of them actually. So Andreas has a collection of the ones that are without n and the ones that tolerate n. And so for the real speech act analysis, we still need the standard kinds of approaches, and there everybody's invited to propose their favorite theories, and I think still an open issue. And so your approach is on the market as the other approaches are. Andreas, do you want to say something about the empirical like exam answers? Is there anything you can think of as?
Well, nothing that relates particularly to Marzahn or Berlin German. What I was thinking about though is, I mean, you can ask exam questions in context where the answer to the question is known by both interlocutors to be wrong. So for example, when you grow up in a dictatorship and you ask certain things, so who is the official representative of our people? And then if you live in a society where only one party exists and this party claims to be the official representative, then of course you will answer it's this party, even though you don't believe it or you don't commit to its truth. And what I was curious is, so you already mentioned Manfred's work on commitment elements. It would be interesting. I mean, one could investigate languages where you have all these kind of markers where you get the information from. So what happens in these languages where you kind of answer questions where you don't actually commit to anything? Can you omit them, or do you use a default particle? So that's the only thing that I could think about now, but nothing that relates to Marzahn German, at least nothing that I could think about now out of thin air.